Welcome. My name is Amanda Lewis. I'm the director of the Institute for Research on Race and Public Policy at UIC. And on behalf of myself and Barbara Ransby, director of the Social Justice Initiative, we would like to welcome you to this really important conversation today on imagining and demanding housing justice in the time of coronavirus. We have an amazing group of panelists here with us today, and we appreciate all of them for joining us and sharing their wisdom. I have the pleasure of introducing our moderator, Gianna Baker, who will then introduce the rest of the panel and moderate the conversation. We also would like to thank CAN TV for partnering with us to broadcast these events. Gianna Baker is the co-executive director of the Chicago Area Fair Housing Alliance, a nonprofit consortium of fair housing and advocacy organizations, social service providers, government agencies, and municipalities committed to the value of fair housing, diversity, and integration. In addition to her work at the Chicago Area Fair Housing Alliance, she currently serves on the governor-appointed board of the Illinois Statewide Independent Living Council, which supports the community integration of people with disabilities. Gianna, thank you so much for being here and for moderating this conversation. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, and I'd like to just welcome everyone to our panel today. As was just said, the Chicago Area Fair Housing Alliance is a membership-based network, and our work is really centered on combating housing discrimination, reversing historic and intentional patterns of disinvestment in communities of color, and advancing equitable community investment. And as we do that work in partnership with organizations throughout the Chicago area, I'm joined today with some experts, leaders in the community who are seeking to do that work. And before we get started and talk a bit and everyone shares about their work and introduces themselves, I think it's just important to take a step back and to look at the context of the work that we're doing and what this pandemic has really showed us. I think that as we've all been engaging in that housing justice work, this pandemic has really exposed that we've all been dealing with a long-term public health crisis, and what I would say that is racism. So when we look at the disproportionate impact on communities of color, when we look at how the first 70 deaths in Chicago, or I should say the first 100 deaths in Chicago, 70 of those residents who died were Black. When we look at the way there's been an uptick in Latinx communities, which are now the leading neighborhoods and zip codes throughout the state, we know that that's really coming from the historic legacy that we have of housing discrimination, of redlining, of housing barriers, of the economic injustice that we've seen in communities of color. And so we really want to take a look at the work we're doing from that lens and to talk about what's necessary as we go forward in the work that we do in our communities. And so I'd just like to quickly introduce each of our panelists, and then I'm going to provide an opportunity for each of you to talk about the work that you're doing. And so we have today here with us Adam Ballard. He's the Housing and Transportation Policy Analyst at Access Living. Leonie Bichere, the Executive Director of Working Family Solidarity. Diane Lewis, who's a community leader and board member at Communities United. Jawanza Malone, the Executive Director of the Kenwood Oakland Community Organization. David Jung, the Director of Capacity Building and Housing Action Illinois. And Kate Waltz, the Vice President of Advocacy and Senior Director of Litigation at the Shriver Center on Poverty Law. So can each of you, as you tell us more about yourself and your work, can you answer this question? How do you engage in housing justice, and who do you engage in that work? And maybe we can get started with Diane, and then I'll just call others to share them about their work.
Sure. Again, my name is Diane Lewis. I'm a Chicagoan that has never given up on the fight to make the city better for all. I'm a daughter of immigrants in a family of 12. I had 11 sisters and brothers, and we grew up in the Humboldt Park area. I watched my parents struggle to find and keep affordable rental housing in the neighborhood, and already in a neighborhood that already felt at that time that the city was not well suited for low-income families like the one that I grew up in. I'm a volunteer. I'm a 20-year volunteer with Communities United. Communities United works in the areas of affordable housing, education, school to prison pipeline, health, immigration, justice reinvestment, youth empowerment, and Survivors Alliance of Healing and Justice. Our work is primarily in the neighborhoods of Albany Park, Westridge, Belmont Cragen, Austin, and Roseland. We address issues related to low-income tenants, preserving the identity of our neighborhood, and addressing the diminishing stock of affordable housing in the city. Since the last foreclosure crisis, we always thought that renters were an afterthought when we worked with our elected officials or any other state or citywide elected officials. What we learned is that low-income renters were always pushed on the side. And we engaged, our work at CU is our boots on the ground door knocking, where we actually engage and talk to the people and talk to the renters. And we learn firsthand from lived experiences that these renters went through. Through their stories, we're able to share their stories with our elected officials. I'll talk a little bit more later on about our accomplishments and laws that we were part of passing. So yeah, that's it.
Thank you. Jawanza, can you introduce yourself?
Sure. So my name is Juwan Malone. I'm the executive director at the Kenwood Oakland Community Organization, the oldest Black-led base building group in the city. For us, I mean, housing work really goes back to our founding in 1965. We are in a gentrifying community. The bread and butter of our work on this issue has been in strengthening and building tenant councils to really balance the imbalanced power dynamic between tenants and landlords. And so for us, it really is about allowing tenants to exercise their collective power to improve just the basic living conditions in the buildings where they call home. Outside of that, we engage in coalition work to have broader policy impact. We're a founding member of the Live the Ban Coalition, working to bring rent control here to Illinois, as well as the Obama CBA Coalition, to really stop the displacement of families from the areas surrounding the Jackson Park, where the Obama Presidential Center is proposed to be built. And for us, it really is about, again, making sure that we stop the displacement that's been happening since the year 2000. We've seen close to 300,000 Black families pushed out of the Chicago area, which has resounding ripple effects throughout everything that impacts our everyday life, from political power and participation to just access to resources in the communities where we call home. And I just want to say, just as one last thing, when we talk about displacement, we aren't talking about people just making a decision based on whatever is going on in their personal lives to say, you know what, I want to move to another neighborhood. Often what happens is, under duress, families are forced to pick up their belongings and go wherever it is they can, often within a very short window of time. And many of these families have become the new face of people facing homelessness. Because once they land wherever it is they're going, they don't have the resources if anything goes wrong to really get back on their feet again. And so we're finding people moving out of neighborhoods in Chicago where their families have called home for generations to places unknown to them, where they have no relationship, no family, no friends, no support system, just to simply try to make it, oftentimes looking for some place with an affordable rent. And again, if something happens, that job they thought they had falls through, they get laid off, fired, there's a medical emergency, anything, these are the people who oftentimes end up on our street. So being able to stop displacement is a huge endeavor to really deal with one of the leading crises in our country right now.
Thank you. David, can you introduce yourself and the work that you do?
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm David Jung. I'm the Director of Capacity Building with Housing Action Illinois. Housing Action Illinois is a state-based membership organization. We have over 170 organizations, mainly nonprofits, that are members of our organization, and we are really the big tent for housing issues across the state of Illinois. We are based in Chicago, but we work throughout the state, and we provide a number of different services for nonprofit organizations who are serving folks throughout the state. We do advocacy as well as public education and organizing and capacity building. In my work with capacity building, I work primarily with developers who are looking to provide more affordable housing opportunities, whether it's rental or home ownership for people in Illinois, and then also with the housing counseling community. Housing Action Illinois is a HUD-approved intermediary, which means that we provide funding and capacity building support to housing counseling organizations. We have 33 sub-grantees in Illinois, as well as a couple of other states in the Midwest. And so we help those folks to do their work through the provision of resources and through providing capacity building assistance.
Thank you. Adam, can you talk about access living and the housing justice work you're doing there?
Absolutely. Hi, everyone. My name is Adam Ballard. I do housing and transportation policy at Access Living. Access Living is the Center for Independent Living in the city of Chicago. Centers for Independent Living are agencies that do direct service and advocacy for people with disabilities in cities across the country. What makes our movement unique is that to be a center for independent living or an independent living center, you have to be governed and staffed by a majority of people who identify as having disabilities. So Access Living has been at the forefront of the disability movement and independent living movement for 40 years now. We're one of the oldest and largest centers in the country, and we work on a variety of issues. I'll obviously specifically focus on housing today. Housing justice is really important to the work we do because disabled people have historically been left out of housing choice and housing opportunity for a couple of I think, easy to understand reasons. The first one related to what other folks have said. People with disabilities, along with some of the other communities that people on this panel serve, are primarily low-income people. 60 to 70% of all disabled adults in the United States do not work. So that means they rely on some kind of a fixed income for survival, and it is bare minimum survival. Social security programs that pay out benefits to people with disabilities, none of them pay enough to afford a one-bedroom apartment anywhere in the United States. So because of that fact, affordable housing is very, very important to our community. and is really key to us living independent lives, or at least the lives that we choose. The other big factor that makes housing justice so important in our community is that the world itself was not built with us in mind, particularly those of us with physical disabilities. Our movement is made up of people with all kinds of disabilities. We serve people and organize people with physical disabilities, sensory disabilities, intellectual, sensory, developmental disabilities. Anyone who identifies as being a disabled person is part of our movement, but especially in housing, the lack of physical access and physical barriers to housing is what makes our work so important. The problem can be summed up this way. Since the passage of the Fair Housing Act amendments in the late 80s and the ADA in 1990, we've actually seen a fair amount of housing that's accessible built in the last 20 to 30 years. The problem is most of that housing is not affordable. And a lot of so-called naturally occurring affordable housing that's out there is of old housing stock, and so therefore is not accessible. So we're trying to find a needle in a haystack, literally. We're trying to find housing that's both affordable and accessible for people. So the people that we work with, that we organize in our work, are people living in that Venn diagram that doesn't quite match up, right? People who need an affordable home and can't find an accessible one, or are needing an accessible home but can't find one in their price range. Those are people we work with. We also work with people who are at risk and even experiencing homelessness. Homelessness is a huge problem in our community. Folks who don't end up on the streets or in shelters end up in nursing homes or other institutional congregate settings. And as the virus has laid bare, and I'll talk more about later, it's become more clear than ever that congregate care, quote unquote, care settings are not a suitable place for anyone, especially when you're trying to protect their health. So we actively try to get people out of those settings and into integrated community settings, which I'll talk about more later, but that's who I am and what we do.
Okay. And last but not least, Kate, if you can introduce the Shriver Center.
Sure. I'm Kate Walls. I'm the Vice President of Advocacy and Senior Director of Litigation at the Shriver Center. Housing justice has been at the core of our work since our inception in 1996. And what we see at the core of housing injustice is the perpetuation of structural racism. And so the work that we do is in an effort to dismantle that because the housing policies that we have in this country have set the futures of millions of people around this country and in the city of Chicago and the state of Illinois. And we think that we can work collectively with community leaders and with tenants directly to disrupt that and to advance real systems change. So as part of that work, we're one of the founding members of the Just Housing Initiative, working to disconnect the criminal legal system from housing policies. I think if you look back at the history, Bill Clinton played a huge role in connecting those two systems. We think that they should be permanently disconnected so that your records should not determine your future in terms of your housing stability. We have also worked on behalf of and with victims of domestic violence and sexual assault, and have been one of the drafters of the Violence Against Women Act housing protections to protect survivors of violence from housing-related discrimination due to their violence, and also to give them options in Illinois and locally so that they can safely move when they are unsafe, which is a particularly important issue right now. And then we've worked with many of the people on this presentation as to housing preservation and affordability. We have to preserve what we have, which is affordable, but we have to do so in a way that is fair and just for the tenants who live there, that they actually have a seat at the table in determining what their housing and their communities look like, and that they are beneficiaries of any redevelopment of their communities, not the victims of it. And then finally, we continue to work towards challenging those policies and practices within the city of Chicago that only put affordable housing in predominantly Black and brown communities and exclusively keep them out of communities of opportunity that may have greater access to public transit, to accessibility, to higher quality public schools, to job opportunities, so that we create in the long run greater equity across the city of Chicago. So you are not defined, or your future is not defined by your zip code.
Right. And actually need to take the time to for Leone to introduce his work.
Yeah, so my name is Leone Jose Bicchieri. I'm the Executive Director of Working Family Solidarity. And our main mission is to unite folks of different ethnic and racial backgrounds, especially African American and Latinx people, to fight together for equitable development. We work primarily in 7 neighborhoods in Pilsen, Little Village, North Lawndale, Back of the Yards, Inglewood, West Inglewood, and Gage Park. We were formed some years ago to unite folks from different races and ethnicities, because we think that a lot of times, especially for African American and Latinx people, we're trained from youth to see each other as competitors for scarce resources. And sometimes that's true, but it's not of our making. And we often look at each other like, I have to beat out those Black folks to get that job, or I have to beat out those Mexican folks to get on that Section 8 list. And in reality, we're both victims, and the more we join together to fight for better jobs and housing, the better off we'll be. So our organization came together to really promote and organize around the idea that we should look at low-wage workers and at the same time look at low-income families. So when we promote a campaign at an industrial laundry like we did at 19th and Washtenaw, a place called Three Brothers Industrial Laundry, which was mainly immigrant workers, had never hired an African American, we pushed, even though I'm Latino, and there were many people from the Latinx community working there, but we pushed not only for better wages and better working conditions, but that the company hire an African American person from the North Lawndale area, which they did. It took about 18 months, but they hired the first ever African American person. We also fought so that at Planned Manufacturing District number 7, not only should those companies, for example, the Cinestar, where they have all the movies that they make and so on, that was sold to a lot of people as, we're going to better the neighborhood. How many African American folks from Lawndale and how many Latino folks from the western edge of Pilsen or the eastern edge of Little Village actually have decent jobs there? Very few. It's mainly white kids from not very poor backgrounds who are interning to, hold a movie star's beverage while they go to the bathroom, right? So we're pushing so that that development looks at low income folks who need housing, largely African American and Latinx, also again to the south of Pilsen, but also at the same time, we need to have an income. We need to have income at jobs, or else how are we going to pay our rent? And at the same time, if we win a really important wage increase and so on, well, look at that. Another rich company who owns a bunch of housing just jacked up our rent $350 or $500 a month. So now we fought 8 months, 10 months, 2 years for a wage increase, and that just went down the drain. And sometimes it's the same private equity company who has connections to the owners of the companies that employ us and where we live. So it's almost like a convoluted company town, right? Like in West Virginia coal mining or in the farm worker movement where I worked for a long time. And it's largely low-income workers of color. So what we're trying to do, we've supported and we continue to support rent control. So we think Lift the Ban is terrific. We're official endorsers of that effort. We have to have rent control. Most countries on earth have it. I've lived in a bunch of other countries. It's absolutely civilized. It's considered normal in the whole world, except for a few countries like ours. In addition, we look at workers, not only if you're working, but if you would like to work, you're still a worker, right? Because the majority of humankind gets up in the morning, sells your labor, physical, intellectual, right? All these owner class or of a housing complex, right? So we want to work together with everyone and have equitable development like a lot of the other terrific folks on this panel and their organizations are doing. And I'll close by just saying, we also want to keep pushing for real discussions on racial unity, not the kind where you act like you like that person on the other side of the table when you really don't. But for the good of the conversation, then Leone says, well, I think all these black folks today are right. But in my heart, I'm thinking, well, hold on a second. I know you're getting moved out of Chicago, but hey, I got to look out for my own. What we really want to challenge ourselves as Latino people, but also look at other races and especially African Americans is say, let's examine why we feel the way we feel, right? And then pull that out and examine where that came from. And then we start to figure out that actually we as Latinx people are not better off if there are no more black people in Chicago. Like Juwanza was just talking about, we're not better off if 200,000 black people are forced out of Chicago in 10 or 15 years. Because guess what? We're next, right? And so we know that our destiny is tied up with African American people. And what we try to do is we have racial unity dialogues that go together with our Know Your Rights trainings on jobs, housing, immigration, criminal justice, and civil rights, so that we try to build a unity that where we try to sincerely feel that if that person in that group is better off, my family and I are better off as well. So that's what we're searching for and try to do a better job of.
Thank you, Leone. And I want to actually go back to you again. Can you talk about how those Black and Latinx workers that you are organizing with, the ways in which they're being impacted by the pandemic?
Well, we're being decimated, just like I'm guessing everyone on this panel probably. We're being decimated. Our work on March 13th, 14th changed radically for the last 9 or 10 weeks. I have done more direct service, if you will, i.e. trying to get food and money to members who are dying and who have died. Our community organizer, my colleague, an African-American woman named Tamika Gavin, who lives a couple communities south of Pilsen, was very sick with COVID-19. Her sister was in intensive care for weeks, barely survived, and their mother passed away 2 weeks ago. Someone who lives a block from where I'm sitting right now in Pilsen, Sylvia, her husband Manuel, they were both sick for weeks. And as soon as they got better, what did they do? Went right back to work, where they probably got sick in the first place. So when all of these wealthy folks are talking about let's return to normal and let's get the economy running, that's code for let's get a bunch of people of color who are really poor and desperate back to the same place where they got sick. And that's disgusting. And people need to think about that. All of these folks, I'm tired of them on TV in other states, a little bit better in Chicago, and all they're talking about is we must restart the economy. I want to see those folks go and be in an emergency room. I want to see them go work at a meatpacking factory. I want to go see them be a healthcare worker, going house to house, getting sick. I want to see them do that. So there's no surprise as to what's happened during COVID-19 for us, just like Katrina, Hurricane Katrina, right? Every time there's an emergency, what happens to poor people of color? We're the first ones to feel the impacts, and we feel them the longest. COVID-19, as so many people, as so many of our members have said in the last 2 months, COVID-19 did not invent the grotesque inequalities in our society, but it's helping to expose them. And it's very, very sad, but unfortunately, yes, many of our members, many of our active members have been sick, have family members who've died, or themselves, a few of them have passed away. And it's a tragedy, but what we're trying to do is help survive in the short term and then remind us all, probably everyone on this call, right? Why did we get into this work in the first place, right? Because we were tired of seeing the same thing that's happening now, even in the quote unquote good times, right? We don't have good times. There are no good times. Our good times are working 3 days a week, and then saying, I got a job working 25 hours, and everyone claps and goes, oh my God, you're so lucky, right? That's the new 40 hours. And so I'll end by just saying, it's such an important time, not a good time, but it's an important time for anyone out there who's wondered if you can make a difference. Please do it, because we need to change the way our country is. We need to close the racial wealth gap. We need to make it much more equal, or every time we have even a minor incident like this, thousands more poor people of color will continue to suffer. So maybe we can come out of all of this and continue to improve even more how we work together.
Juwanza, can you talk about how families are being impacted on the South Side?
Sure. Unfortunately, not very different than what Leonie just expressed. I'll come at it from a slightly different angle, though. When we look at the role of corporate landlords in the housing market, but beyond, in our general economy, we see the kind of perverse exploitation of people that, again, Leonie talked about moments ago, right? Where you have corporate landlords unashamedly violating Governor Pritzker's moratorium on evictions and the Federal CARES Act that is intended to protect tenants in federally backed mortgage properties. How is it you can have these wayward actors acting without discretion, again, throughout Black and brown communities on the south and west sides of the city, and they not be held accountable, right? We have multiple investors on the record saying that properties on the west side, on the south side, are prime opportunities for them because they can purchase these properties at low cost and rent them out at high rents. And we aren't talking about that higher rent producing improved living conditions, where you have a dilapidated building and now it's the pride of the community. We're talking about a dilapidated building, sometimes with some cosmetic improvements, where the quality of service is worse than it was when it was a mom and pop landlord barely getting by. And so we have a situation where we're told to shelter in place, where things have been locked down and protections, modest protections have been put in place. And the same people who benefited from the virtual collapse of the global economy by going into multifamily rental housing after people were forced out of their homes due to the foreclosure crisis, who are now evicting people in the midst of a pandemic, when people aren't working because they were told not to work, right? When the stay-at-home order was made, businesses were told you got a day to shut down, right? Close your doors. If you can't figure out how to provide carry-out service or curbside service and you're non-essential, you are not operating. So whatever sacrifices you made to get your business off the ground, hopefully you got a reserve somewhere. And so all those people who worked for those companies are at home, not knowing where a paycheck is going to come from, right? In some instances, you have tenants who are considered this essential worker class in the service industry. So the places, like, again, Leona said, where people were getting sick in the first place, now you have people forced to work there because they got to eat, they got to pay rent, despite the fact that a moratorium on evictions was declared through the emergency power of the governor. The landlords are still filing eviction notices. Like right now, right? Just yesterday, more eviction notices were filed. And where's the enforcement of this executive order? Where's the enforcement of the Federal CARES Act? And again, we're talking predominantly on in the black and brown communities on the west and south sides of Chicago. So on top of people not being able to bury their loved ones, we have a leader who has been trying to figure out how to freeze her sister's body because she wants to have an actual funeral for her, right? So in addition to people trying to figure out how to care for their loved ones, how to stay healthy and safe themselves, they got to worry about how they're going to pay rent when they have no income coming in through no fault of their own. These aren't people who got fired from their jobs, right? These aren't people who just walked off the job and said, you know what, I'm not coming back. I don't want to do this anymore. These are people who are working one day and were told to go home and not come back to work the next day because our business has been closed. And so these corporate landlords, and I don't mean to rant here, but there's one landlord that we targeted a couple of weeks ago, TLC Management. They were violating not just the Governor Pritzker's moratorium on evictions, but violating the CARES Act as well. Again, federal law. And so when we called them out and reporters began to reach out to them and say, hey, what's going on with this, right? There's these people saying you are violating federal law. They attempted to discredit our claim. Say, well, no, that doesn't apply to us. We have a federally backed mortgage, but we're entitled to kick people out if we feel justified in doing so. And by the end of that day, by 5 o'clock, they came back and said, you know what? Our lawyers looked at the law again, and we're going to vacate those evictions. Oh. And we're supposed to applaud that, right? They knew they were violating federal law, and they were planning to get away with it and thought they were going to get away with it until they kept getting phone calls from reporters asking them about information that we provided to them, right? And so what about all the other numbers of corporate landlords across the city, across the state, across the country who are doing the exact same thing to Black and brown people predominantly? And I would argue that the reason why it's allowed is because it's happening to Black and brown people predominantly. The last thing I'll say is WBEZ released a story this week where you have renters who are going without running water. Again, through no fault of their own. They are sitting in an apartment where they are paying rent to somebody. And again, in the middle of a pandemic where people are told to wash their hands multiple times, they don't have running water. There is an older gentleman covered in the story who walked with a decanter, the thing you use, the large bottle of water, I don't know how many gallons it is, walked to the fire hydrant to get water to take back to his apartment to cook, clean, and wash his body with. How is that acceptable?
Yeah.
And so I'll just end with saying that the only bill that was being considered in Springfield last week during their emergency session to find relief for the people of Illinois was killed by the realty lobby after they took the sponsor through intense negotiations to water down the bill. They still organized to kill it. And so if these are the people we're supposed to negotiate with, if these are the people we have to rely on to house us in the good and the bad times, we're in a bad spot.
We're in trouble. Yeah. If Gianna, if I could add to that, at Communities United, we're hearing about Latinx families testing positive, at a high rate, right? And we know that through our door knocking, one thing that surprised us is that we saw that a lot more families, our Latinx families, were doubling up, right? Than we originally thought. And then you hear these stories about, why are Latinx families more susceptible to the virus? Well, think of their living conditions. Do they have any, when you're living in a 6-room apartment with 10 or 11 people, how can you, safe space? How can you provide safe space for everyone? You can't do that, okay? And it just shows how the lack of affordable housing in the city has gone on so long that people are actually doubling up because they can't find affordable housing to live independently of each other, right? And if the pandemic doesn't show the consequence of the lack of affordable housing in this city, then what is going to show it, right? We hear our Latinx families, our immigrant families that we represent in the areas that we organize in, saying, how am I going to pay my rent? How am I going to pay my utilities? What's going to happen to me? The thought of becoming homeless for these families is a reality to them. They go to bed every night thinking that them and their family are going to end up being homeless. That's a true reality to them. People that used to, proud, parents that took care of their family, either male or female, that were responsible for paying the bills and making sure that food was put on the table, and the proud that they were able to do that, can no longer do that. The emotional strain that people are going through, especially our undocumented immigrants, they get no help from anyone. People are going to work from doubling up families because they have no money coming into that family. They're going to work. They have to, what choice do they have? They'd like to live independently. They'd like to practice distancing. How do you do that? How do you do that and feed your family? How do you do that? So, again, it's who are our elected officials? One thing that Communities United is trying to bring attention to is what Juwanza talked about. There's a big difference between a corporate landlord that owns 10 buildings of 150 units apiece and a little 2-flat owner that lives in his building that depends on rents from the one unit that he's renting out to pay his mortgage. There's a difference between those two types of landlords. We have to think about how are we going to protect our small landlord that owns and is trying to pay a mortgage in a 2 to 4 flat. That is completely different than a corporate landlord. What are we doing? Forbearance is nice for that corporate landlord, but it shouldn't be forbearance for a small owner of a 2 to 4 flat. It should be forgiveness. They should be forgiven on what they owe. They can't afford, they'll never catch up with forbearance, never. So what are our elected officials and our state legislators doing to protect that small 2 to 4 flat owner? That is giving natural occurring. That's a natural occurring affordability in that 2 to 4 flat. That are low wage earners are able to live in that building. What are we doing to protect that building? We know how many foreclosures we lost in 2008. How much of our 2 to 4 flat buildings we lost, either to demolition, to deconversion. How many more are we going to lose after this pandemic is over of our 2 to 4 flat natural occurring housing? So yeah, I agree with what Joanna said and Leonie. There's a lot of things that we have to think about post COVID-19.
And thank you, Diane. Diane mentioned the financial crisis of 2008. And I'd like to just get your thoughts on what lessons we can learn from the financial crisis, and just putting your work into more context. I know that you partner with community-based housing counseling organizations that are in the trenches, who were working with homeowners during the financial crisis to prevent foreclosures, to advocate for affordable loan modifications, and to provide financial relief to homeowners. And so I want you to just give us some thoughts on what we can learn from that financial crisis as we're now in this health crisis, and the same communities are being devastated and really have not fully recovered from the wealth that was lost during that period of time.
Sure, Gianna. I think when this process started a few weeks ago that the initial thought was that this was going to be a little bit different from 2008, right? Because that people would be back to work fairly quickly, and that a forbearance would be suitable for a lot of homeowners. But what we're finding with this continuing on and on for a couple of months, that the fallout from this is going to be quite severe for homeowners, because I think that there are a number of industries that have been impacted by this pandemic that are not going to come back the same way, if at all. You know, we are seeing just in the last couple of weeks, we've seen several bankruptcies for large retailers. We know that a lot of restaurants are barely hanging on, which means that a lot of those workers who are employed by those organizations, you know, are not going to get their jobs back. There's not going to be a recovery for them, or their job is going to come back, but it's going to be at less hours and less pay than what it was before, which means that folks are going to need the long-term solutions in order to assist them with keeping their homes. I think one of the things that's happened now compared to 2008 is that people are recognizing that faster and are looking to put the resources in place. Just recently, the House of Representatives passed the $3 trillion HEROES Act, which also includes mortgage assistance as well as rental assistance. And so we're hoping that there will be action on that very quickly, because I know that the Senate has been taking a wait and see approach in terms of the need for additional resources for recovery. One of the other things that I'd want to point out, Gianna, that's been very different for the housing counseling community now compared to 2008 is that in 2008, 2009, 2010, housing counseling organizations across the country primarily heard from and helped owner occupants that were facing default, that were facing foreclosure. What we are seeing now is an incredibly significant increase in rental households that are reaching out to the housing counseling community, asking for assistance regarding payment of rent or evictions. And so for the housing counseling community, we have been advocating both at the state and the national level to make sure that resources are available to not only help out homeowners, but also help out renters that are impacted. I mean, so many of the speakers today have talked about those incredible issues and how it's impacting people. I happened to watch a news story last week that showed a family, I believe, that lived in Little Village that, as Diane said, had several, more than one generation living in the same household. And you had a number of those family members that had gotten sick, that once they felt better, were going back to work. And we don't really know, if this is something that a person can have once and they're not going to have again. So what does it mean to go back into that environment? We also know that in terms of Illinois, we are more than, or I should say in Chicago, that we are more than 100,000 units short of affordable housing. And we need significantly more housing to be built in order to meet that demand and to allow for families to have suitable housing so that they're not doubling and tripling up into the same spaces. So I would just want to conclude by saying that the important things that we learned for the housing counseling community was one, that We needed to put people, especially homeowners, in touch with their servicers immediately, which we have been doing. There was real confusion in 2008 as to what servicers could do. And of course, there were a number of servicers that were having issues deciding what they should do or what they could do. So we've been working very closely with servicers to make sure that the process is very clear, so that if a homeowner calls us, we can provide them with the assistance, we can help them with what they need, but also working on the advocacy side to make sure that resources are available, that we are continuing to work to make sure that those resources are available to the families that really need it. I think one other thing that I would like to add is that Housing Action Illinois has been doing a regular survey of the housing counseling community in Illinois about every 2 weeks or so, because we wanted to understand what the housing counseling community is seeing, who they're hearing from. And we started doing this in the middle of March, and every survey that we've done 3 so far, and we'll have another one that's probably coming out next week. Every survey that we've done has shown significant increases in calls across the state from people that are concerned about their housing and both rental and home ownership. So, you know, just like everybody on the call has echoed, the need is great. We can see it, and being able to translate that information to our legislators and getting action will be of utmost importance.
If I could add to something David said,
sure.
I agree with David said in regards to new affordable housing should be built. But what the city has really neglected over the year, year after year, is the actual preservation of existing housing, of affordable housing we have, like our 2 to 4 unit housing stock. You know, preserve what we have. It's a lot cheaper to preserve a unit of affordable housing than to create a new unit of affordable housing. So just to add that to what David said.
And to that end, everyone has talked about the impact of the lack of affordable housing and how families are being displaced. Adam, the families that you work with through Access Living are not only dealing with affordability, they're also seeking accessible housing. So can you talk about how they've been impacted by the pandemic and the work that Access Living has been doing?
Yeah, definitely. So like everyone else has pretty much said, I think, the pandemic hasn't necessarily exposed a lot of new problems, as just revealed the underlying problems that were already there. So, you know, everything that's been said so far by folks before me, I wholeheartedly agree with. My 2 cents before I get into disability specific stuff on the real estate lobby is that until we understand that big real estate is as damaging a force in this country as big energy and big pharma, we're gonna have a hard time making real progress. We all know this, right? But I really hope that that awareness can continue to grow, because they aren't the villains, right, in the same way that those other big corporate entities that I mentioned are yet, and they should be. That said, I think it's important to understand that the disability community's need for housing isn't necessarily any more acute than it was before the crisis, but it has become even more stark what the life and death consequences are for our community, as it has, honestly, for a lot of communities. There's a big intersection, right, between the communities that my friends here on the panel serve in our community, especially here in Chicago and a lot of cities. Most of the people we serve are people of color. I think 90% or more of the people that come in our doors looking for services are Black or brown folks. And think a reason for that we in the disability community even don't always like to talk about a whole lot, but I think we're getting a little better at it, is that there's this high correlation between poverty and disability. It should be obvious because, like I said in my opening, so many of us aren't working, but we don't, despite that fact, we haven't always done a good job at drawing lines between the fact that the life experiences of poor disabled folks are either the same as or, again, completely overlap with the lived experiences of poor folks from any community. Poverty is a disabling condition, and disability is an impoverishing condition. And it's really a chicken egg question, right? I don't know what started it, but the point is they feed each other. So folks who live in poverty most of their lives tend to pick up extra disabilities, and people who live their lives or part of their lives or most of their lives with a disability are gonna probably end up in poverty. The two just really feed each other. So until I think my community is talking more honestly about that, we're going to continue to have our own challenges. We also need our partners and allies to talk about it as well and acknowledge that there's disabled people in every community and that are facing displacement, that are facing the pain of job loss, if not directly, then from a family member, right? Because so many disabled people still live with family. So a job loss is going to impact that person with a disability as well, even if it wasn't their job that was lost. And their housing, the housing for them as well as their families now been put at risk. So I think what the angle I want to bring that hasn't been mentioned a whole lot yet is the public health angle and how that impacts our community specifically. COVID-19 has been a pandemic that especially preys on and is virulent in communities that have what are usually called euphemistically underlying conditions or pre-existing conditions. When we hear that in our community, we just hear disability, right? And this goes back way a long time, you know, the fights for healthcare over the years in the 90s, the Affordable Care Act, all the way on until today. Whenever people start talking about pre-existing conditions, they're talking about disabilities. So what's happening is that disabled people are at a higher risk to die from COVID-19 than anyone else. And yeah, a lot of those disabled people are people of color because of the systemic racism and other inequities that we've talked about throughout this discussion. But I think we need to be honest about that. For me, saying an underlying medical condition is a euphemism. You mean a disability, and we should talk about that. We should be more honest about that. So because people with disabilities are dying at a higher rate, because of both the virus and a lack of access to other key medical services because of the strain on the system, I've known just as many people who have died during this pandemic from not being able to access medical services, right, who didn't have COVID at all. So the pandemic is killing people in two ways. It's either killing them directly because they catch the virus, or it's killing people who can't access maintenance health care that keeps them alive because of the strain on the system. And because the president thinks that lupus drugs make him Superman. So people are dying from lupus now who shouldn't. Anyway, I could rant too. I'm like Joanza said, I'm gonna try to avoid that. So it's a life and death issue for us, even more starkly now than it was before. Half of the cases of COVID-19 in the state of Illinois are nursing homes. Nursing homes aren't just for seniors, they're also for disabled people. They shouldn't be, but they are. So our elders and or people with disabilities, some of them younger who aren't elders, are dying at a higher rate than is acceptable because they're warehoused in places that they never should have been in the first place. People with disabilities, and again, I'm talking in a very broad sense here, right? Not just physical disability, but all kinds of disabilities, learning disabilities, intellectual disabilities. They're at a much higher likelihood of being incarcerated. So our jails and prisons where people are dying are also filled with people with disabilities. We don't talk about that enough. Again, including within my community. We need to talk about that more. We need to talk about the fact that disabled people are dying in prisons and jails, and that's not okay. why are people dying in nursing homes and jails and prisons and homeless encampments? Because there's no housing, for all of the reasons that we've discussed, right? All the reasons that Leonie and Jawanza and Diane have mentioned, the disconnect that I mentioned of affordable housing not being accessible and accessible housing not being affordable. All of these things connect with each other and interlace together to form just this huge mess. And our community, like so many communities, is really hurting. I'm not going to pretend otherwise at this point. I think, to kind of leave off for now, what we're trying to do about it is we're trying to work with our partners here, because we understand, like our partners understand, that we're so much more powerful together. So issues that impact families on the South and West Side impact my community. The forced exodus of Black families from the city of Chicago impacts my community. So we're working on the things that a lot of people have already mentioned. We are also part of the Lift the Ban Coalition. We're also pushing really hard to make sure that development in the city going forward doesn't displace. New construction is a little more important for us because, again, it's easier to create accessibility in new construction. But I also agree with what Diane said. We should preserve as much existing affordable housing as we can. It's not a zero-sum game, right? We don't have to do one at the expense of the other. We can preserve our existing affordable housing and build new accessible affordable housing. And if we're not pushing for all those things, then we're not really winning. And I just happen to believe that the people on this panel are the people I want to be fighting with. So I'm glad to be here with you all again.
Kate, Adam mentioned incarceration. And so I wanted us to spend some time talking about the work that the Shriver Center has done, and certainly the Chicago Area Fair Housing Alliance has been working with you on that. Can you talk first about the efforts of advocates to advocate for people to be released early from Cook County Jail and then the Illinois prisons, and then talk about the work that you are doing to really address the housing barriers that people are experiencing as they're returning home to the community?
Sure. So I think Jawanza noted this before, that, you know, when the governor's order came down and said everyone must shelter in place, it seemed to be disconnected from the reality that we are living in, right? That people were already not safely sheltered, or were homeless, or highly vulnerable to homelessness. It also completely ignored people who are in congregate settings, and that is our Black and primarily Black and brown individuals in our prisons and our jails. And it was surprising to me in having these conversations how shocked people were by that reality of the number of people we have who are incarcerated, who cannot safely shelter in the state of Illinois. And then when you really look at the numbers, the vast majority are there for technical violations. There has been a condition of their parole that they have violated, including that they may not have had housing, that caused them to return to the Department of Corrections at great expense to the state of Illinois, but also at great expense to their freedom. And now literally to their health and to their safety. And so at the outset, our organization, CAFA, all the members of the Just Housing Initiative, and many of the criminal justice advocates to push for a broad mass release of individuals from the prisons and the jails, and to say that that is the safest solution to get them out as quickly as possible. But then we started to hear, again, a surprise conversation with public officials, essentially words to the effect of, did you know that it's very hard to get housing when you are exiting a prison or a jail, because you are judged at screening by your record. We knew this, we had worked on this. This was the whole purpose of the Just Housing Initiative. So we have finally been able to have conversations that are real about what are the barriers to housing access for persons who've had contact with the system. And we've made some small strides, but honestly, we need much more systemic change. We simply do not need this many people confined to the jail system because they can't make bail. There shouldn't be a bail system, and because that is just a condition of being poor, right? And then we shouldn't have this many people in the Department of Corrections. And we have to really ask ourselves, are they there because the towns that are there need those as a base of employment? Or are they there because they are actually a threat to public safety? And does this actually lead us to becoming a safer and more inclusive community? And I think the answer would be that it does not. And so then we have to move towards broad decarceration and a delinkage of the criminal legal system from the housing system. And what I really mean by that is you are not evaluating a person's ability to be a good tenant on whether or not they've been arrested before or have a criminal conviction. It should be on the basis of whether or not they can be a good tenant, right? Are they able to pay their rent? Do they maintain their unit? Are they a good neighbor? They're using a measure that has been sanctified around the country without scientific evidence that it's actually sound, but with strong evidence that it creates great racial disparities, that it's highly predictive of who would be excluded from that housing based upon race. So we've pushed for a couple of things. A pilot program with the Illinois Housing Development Authority, where they would set aside existing dollars that they have for 2019 to create transitional housing opportunities for persons coming out of jail or prison, and that they would be offered assistance through TASK and the Safer Foundation to help them find that housing. We know that people who have been released, because there has been an uptick in the number released, many will initially have housing and then immediately come back to TASK or Safer and say, my housing has become unstable for whatever reason. And so we need to still at the same time create long-term permanent housing solutions. And IDA is committed to doing it. And Director Faust has, with her team, has said that they intend to be in this with us for the long term, which is great. But we also need to push existing housing providers to be more inclusive. And that includes our public housing authorities around the country. And in the state of Illinois, there was a HUD waiver issued in April, and that HUD waiver said, essentially, you can immediately change your tenant screening policies, housing authorities, and you can allow changes to your guest policies. And so we've really pushed for the housing authorities to say, if you have households who have loved ones who are exiting jail or prison, you should let them know that they can avail themselves of these policies should you accept them, which it's totally up to the PHA to do, so that they can safely shelter in place with their family and be reconnected with their community. This is what the PHA should be doing to be partners in this effort. But again, it doesn't even stop with the PHAs. All property owners should be welcoming to individuals who've had contact with the criminal legal system, and ultimately go back to where it was before, where they were not doing this level of screening that they do now, which often results in essentially an automatic exclusion of an individual if they've had contact with the system.
Thank you, Kate. We're going to make sure that we provide more information, as Kate was talking about the Just Housing Amendment and the protections that are provided to families through that law in Cook County. But Kate, I'd like to ask if you can talk about housing protections for survivors of domestic violence. We know that in any time of crisis, and even now, that there's been an uptick in reports of domestic violence, and that in particular, survivors are more vulnerable to being evicted for issues related to the abuse that they experience, whether that's a matter of a lease violation or calling police. So can you just briefly touch on the protections that are in place for survivors?
Sure. And I'll say too that every case is distinct with a survivor of violence. It is not always, and often it's not, in fact, your typical battery case where the police are called and the landlord is afraid about the police being called and they threaten to evict the victim. Oftentimes, it's also about economic abuse, that the perpetrator may control all the household finances and not let the victim have access to that and threaten the victim's housing assistance as a result. So it takes many forms, and we need everyone in our community to understand the sort of broad and unique nature of domestic violence. But there are a couple of laws that can protect survivors. First, there's the Illinois Safe Homes Act that allows a victim of domestic violence or sexual assault to end their lease early if there's a credible imminent threat of domestic violence or sexual assault against them on the premises. They can also secure an emergency lock change at their expense, so they can apply for homeless prevention dollars for the emergency lock change. And so they can do that lock change in order to stay in the unit, but to exclude the perpetrator if they meet those terms. Victims of domestic violence and sexual assault who live in most forms of federally subsidized housing can also access protections under the Violence Against Women Act. And that law says broadly, you cannot evict someone due to an incident of domestic violence or sexual assault against them on the premises or criminal activity directly related thereto. And the Federal CARES Act that a few of the speakers have mentioned specifically says you can still evict a perpetrator even with the otherwise eviction moratorium under the federal law.
Thank you. As we get ready to close our panel, I think what I've heard many people talk about is this desire to get back to normal. But we know in the communities we're working in, normal was not working. That was a problem. And so as we close our session, I would like for everyone to answer this question. How do we demand and imagine housing justice today in preparation for the future? And how can those viewing join in that effort? Maybe we can get started with Juwanza.
So first, thank you for the invitation to participate on this panel. As Adam said, I mean, these are the people that I see when we're out here fighting this fight, and the people I want to continue to fight this fight with, because I think there is definitely shared value among us. Adam also said that we really have to take seriously the role of these corporate entities who are taking larger and larger chunks of our housing market under their private control, and what exactly that means, right? When we think about the campaign for rent control, the ability to regulate how much rent can be increased at one point in time, it goes far beyond just being able to stop skyrocketing rent, which is something we definitely need to do. It also speaks to our ability to house low income, working, poor people in the future. When we think about how much money Congress has appropriated to HUD just for the voucher program, not talking about traditional public housing or other sorts of subsidies, just the voucher program itself, that amount of money has doubled in the billions of dollars. But what we are seeing are fewer and fewer families actually getting housed from this huge investment that's being made. And the only thing that's changed over time is how much rent is, right? When you have, again, these corporate owners who've come into the market simply because people were pushed out of their homes during a foreclosure crisis, right? They fled the home ownership market and went into the rental market because they still had to have some place to live, whether they could afford their mortgage or not, right? And so now you have this huge demand on supply. And so any investor will tell you, right, that's a win-win for them. And capital, venture capital firms, private equity firms have shifted their profit model to include multifamily housing development. And the only reason is because it's an unregulated industry. There is no check or balance to how much profit you as an owner can make in a real estate market. Is whatever it is you think you can get. And again, when you have people whose only option is to live on the street or pay whatever it is being asked of them to pay, people figure out how to do it. And when they are unable to do it, the other option becomes the only viable alternative. And so we have a situation where, again, you have this huge investment that's been made into the voucher program that's housing fewer people. And when the voucher program has become the go-to for our elected officials who don't want to spend the money to either create or preserve affordable housing, what are we left with? And so because people are unable to be housed right now, and we're seeing the impact of this market sort of virulently, ravenously eating away at tenants themselves, right? The lifeblood of the realty market. There's something really, really wrong here. And until we begin to remove that again, perverse profit incentive that exists, we're going to continue to have this problem, and the problem is only going to get worse. And so for us, through the Lift the Ban Coalition, advocating for rent control, trying to get our legislators to understand we have to regulate rent, we anxiously accept any and everybody who wants to get in this fight with us because it is a necessary fight. It is one of the basic things we have to do in order to ensure long-term affordability of housing. Beyond creating, preserving affordable housing, if we don't regulate rent, what's built today that's affordable will not be affordable tomorrow. And we're seeing it across the city of Chicago. We're seeing it across the state of Illinois. We're seeing it across this country. And so just in closing, I think most people probably know this already. Illinois is the only state in the country that has lost population 6 years in a row. Out of 50 states, Illinois is the only one that continues to lose population. And in 2017, Boston University ran a study to figure out why people are leaving cities. When everybody was flocking to cities at one point in time, we now see people leaving these cities in mass numbers. And Boston University wanted to figure out why. The number one reason why people were leaving cities was because of housing costs. They could not afford it. And so in addition to Illinois being the only country that lost population 600 years in a row, we see Chicago being the only major metropolitan area in the country that's also losing population 5 years going now. And so what is happening? Is it worth a few people making unrestricted profit and the rest of the country collapses? And I think that's really the question that we have in front of us. that this crisis is really, again, elevating. There's a crisis that's been here. But now that you have layers on top of layers of protections for tenants that are going ignored, we really need to start asking ourselves, is it worth it?
Thank you. I'm going to ask if everyone can be brief as we close, because we're really close to time. Diane, can you?
Okay, sure. So the COVID-19 put a spotlight on the affordable housing crisis in the city and its deep socioeconomic divide. Families living in unsafe, unhealthy units, people doubling up. This has been going on forever, right? Communities United did an analysis that estimates that more than $26 billion is needed. $26 billion is needed to create enough affordable housing units in the city. Now is the time to think bold, right? Let's start having discussions about this $26 billion that would create affordable housing for families living in these unsafe, unhealthy units, and create affordable units for families that are doubling up. In 2019, the city spent less than 1/2% of its corporate budget on housing. Less than 1/2% of its corporate budget on housing. This needs to change. It is essential that leaders like folks at this table plans for what happens after COVID-19. It's up to us to push. We all know what we need. We know what we need. We talked about it through this panel. We need to be bold. As we look ahead to the pandemic aftermath, it is of greatest importance that any strategies to repair this city include more affordable housing, more preservation of existing affordable housing, and any policies that are created go through a very strict racial equity lens. We need to think bold. Think 26 billion. 26 billion. Thank you.
Thanks. Adam, can you speak to?
Sure. It was mentioned earlier in the call, and I know it's a big push for the community trust right now, which is actually a good thing. We're hearing a lot lately. Even the mayor was talking about this at least before the pandemic hit, about how important it is to close the racial wealth gap. I think a lot of the ideas you just heard from Juwanza and Diane speak to that. I agree with everything they said. And let's keep in mind that if we're closing the racial wealth gap, if we're making that first and foremost our guiding star, then we're going to close so many other inequities as well, including the ones that face the disability community specifically. So let's close the racial wealth gap, but let's do it by doing the big things that others talked about. Let's find ways to control rent burden for people, whether it's rent control or other major systemic interventions. They have to happen. We have to find ways to make massive investments in infrastructure to create the new housing that we need. We need to do, there's no one solution. It's several big swings we have to take at once, because we've tried to fight incrementally for so long, and the interests that others, and I've tried myself to describe, are happy for us to focus on incremental change and incremental wins, because they'll just keep taking a bigger and bigger chunk of the pie as long as we're focused on that. So it's taking, at this point, we have no choice and honestly nothing left to lose than to try and win several things, big things at once, and to keep pushing for them. We need to do that, and I think we have at least a chance. So I hope we can do it.
Okay. Kate, can you share your closing remarks?
I think we have for so long valued the homeowner in this country, right? We see it as sort of quintessentially part of the American dream. And we've made these assumptions about homeowners bringing so much to communities and improving communities and making them better. And we ignore entirely renters And we put them as a second class, if at best, in terms of their value. It is what Jawanza and others have saying. They sort of, you get what you get and you don't get upset, is the philosophy if you are a renter in this country. Even though, especially in Chicago, we see that renters actually stay in communities longer than condo owners. They contribute more to the communities. They're more there in terms of community organizing and investment and creating equity. They are not there purely for their own self-interest, which actually homeowners more likely are to be. And so what can we do to build their power and demand that they not only have a seat at the table, but they build the table? Because Juanza was absolutely right at the outset, talking about what happened in Springfield last week, right? The realtors and their level of power and resources and money have been a problem for years in Springfield. And essentially, if you get their consent, you can pass a law. But we don't need consent, we need systems change. Because we're never going to, we're just sort of nipping around the edges if we don't finally deal with the fact that there are huge inequities for renters, and that creates huge racial disparities, huge disparities for persons with disabilities. And so we have to demand that type of platform and say that we are a renter nation and we demand the rights as part of that renter nation. And then just to echo what Diane said for the city of Chicago, we cannot continue to rely upon the good graces of developers who give to the in lieu of fund as the basis for our affordable housing plan and vision for the city of Chicago. It is entirely fraught, and there is no way we'll dig ourselves out of this hole. We'll only make the hole deeper.
David?
So I just want to, for this panel, I don't think any of us need the reminder, but for everyone else, that, we really have to make this personal. And what I mean by that is oftentimes, if there is a discussion about something happening in the city and someone, the press says South Side or West Side, for a certain population in our city, once they hear South Side or West Side, that means that they can tune it out because it has nothing to do with them. And I think it's the same way with the coronavirus, and especially with the housing issue, is that for a lot of people, even though this has affected so much of the economy, they're still disconnected from it. They had the discomfort of being at home or maybe having to order food from Instacart as opposed to being able to wander around the store, but they've been able to live their lives pretty comfortably. Where there have been a lot of other families that have been deeply impacted by this and even lost loved ones. And if we are going to get people to feel, to empathize, and to understand that they're a part of this, then we have to personalize this issue and show the impacts. And we have to talk about the families that have been impacted and tell the part that they did to make Chicago better, and why it's important that we act on their behalf, that we act for their legacy. Because if we don't get the larger population to understand how they are engaged in this and how it affects us all, I don't think we're going to be able to act boldly as we'd like to do.
Leonie, we're going to give time for you to provide our closing remarks for the panel.
Yeah, which is going to be difficult because everyone who's spoken right now before me in their closing remarks has said really great things. So I'm going to see if I can add a few additional things and not repeat too much, because what was said was really, really terrific. So one of the things for us at Working Family Solidarity and myself in a lot of years of organizing in other parts of the country and in other countries, in rural areas with rural white folks and also people of color in rural areas and in Chicago now for a number of years, is, as we all know, it's about power. And so one of the things that we see, and it feels like we've all been talking about this today, is you can't have housing justice without examining the context within which we're trying to get that justice. And the political economy of our country is free market capitalism. And as several people have touched on, we're taught since we're little that if you don't have something, it's because you haven't worked hard enough, right? And if you're unemployed, you haven't found that shoe shine job. And that's such a disservice, right? Because the reality is capitalism only functions particularly well with high unemployment. Several people today have talked about that, right? Remember 2008? Oh no, it's a terrible recession. Not for rich folks. They do great. So you always have to say who you're talking about. The North American Free Trade Agreement? Oh, how horrible. It didn't really help Mexico or the US. It was never designed to do that, right? It was designed to help rich people in the US and Mexico and bring immigrants north, like a lot of my family members, right? To then make sure there's more workers for that one job that everyone's desperate for, especially poor workers of color. So it hurts everyone. And housing is so similar. And I feel like so many people today have said that so well, right? The corporate definition of life. We're not human beings in their eyes, in the most wealthy people's eyes, right? That 1%, we're not people, we're labor. We're people who provide money through rent or work or parking meters, you know, driving tickets and so on. But we're seen as generating wealth for other people. And so it's funny because in this country, over time, I began to see, and I still feel this way so many years later, that we have to really examine wages, housing, and so on within our political economy's context, but also, and I feel like people have talked about that all day today really well, in our socio-cultural context. And what's the socio-cultural paradigm in the United States? It's white supremacy, right? It's not just racism, it's white supremacy. And it has to be one. It can't be just, let's all not get along. It has to be, these folks are at the top. Why? Because then the rest of us kind of self-stratify after that. So I, as a lighter skinned Latino, have been told since I was a little guy, don't go be a doctor, lawyer, shut your mouth, you're half Italian, don't, pull out the Mexican part of your name, and you're gonna be okay. Because if you act stupid, then you're going to be like the folks that came a few years ago from Mexico, or you're going to be in trouble. And so we stratify along those things. So we Latinos are not going to care as much, many rich people hope, if 200,000 African Americans are pushed out of Chicago. We're told, hey, don't worry about them, worry about you. And how many Latinos people have told me, worry about your own people. And maybe as we close, we can think about, who are my own people? Who are they? They're everyone who's on this call today. There's everyone who's on this call today. It's more about that class structure. If you're producing for someone else and you're not in the owner class, you're one of us. And here's the secret, right? Remember that movie Ants, about all the ants going against the few big grasshoppers? Here's the secret. There's way more of us than there are of them, right? Except we got to be organized. And so in closing, what I would say, and I know some of the people on this call really well, others I know a little bit, but I've learned a lot from a lot of people here. I hope we keep doing these kinds of talks, because if we get together and figure out and get more of our communities to understand how much we have in common, the majority of us, then we can turn our society from viewing us into producers of wealth through rent and work and other things, and as human beings. So I look forward to doing that together.
Deanna, if I could say, I didn't answer the last part of your question on people viewing our panel. How could they get involved? I mean, I think all of us are looking for volunteers to be part of our organizations and work with us in our struggle. But also, if you don't have, the time to put into meetings and other discussions with elected officials, we're always ready, if you like our work, to give us a donation, right? Because the donations coming in really helps us keep going. So if you want to be part of our organization, I'm sure any of us would be more than glad to have you as a volunteer, or again, if you want to donate to the good work that you think we're doing, feel free to do that.
Thank you so much. I want to thank all of our panelists who joined us today, and just so grateful to be with you and to have this conversation and the work that we continue to do in the community of just building power. I think that we will make a way to provide our information so that people can contact us or know how to get in contact with our organizations. And I also, again, lift up the Just Housing Initiative that many of the organizations on this call are part of, so that you can get to that website and get more details on those housing protections. And we've got Lift the Ban Coalition and so much work that's being done here. So I just want to thank you again, and appreciated your time.
Thank you.